when you picture nuclear power, there's usually this deeply ingrained expectation of something completely stationary. You imagine these massive, immovable concrete cooling towers just kind of buried deep in the countryside
Oh,
somewhere.
for sure. They're static, they're locked in place, and they really define the entire landscape around them. I mean, it feels like a monument to human engineering that will just sit there for a century.
Right. Which makes complete sense because that is the visible public face of the industry.
Yeah, we build these cathedrals of concrete and steel, and they feel just as permanent as the earth they're rooted in.
But then you start actually looking at the logistics of global nuclear power today, and suddenly that stationary concrete dome just totally vanishes.
Yeah.
If you're sitting there assuming nuclear energy is just this grid of immovable land plants, well, we are about to completely shatter that assumption for you.
We really are, because the reality we're looking at today is moving, it's floating, and frankly, it's far more precarious than those static concrete towers would have you believe.
Exactly. So, welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we are taking a really fascinating stack of sources, covering everything from naval military logistics to intense nuclear physics, international law, and even climate science. And we're synthesizing all of it. Our mission here is to answer one massive question for you. Who actually controls the world's nuclear power today, and what is its most surprising vulnerability?
And to answer that, we really have to rethink our most basic assumptions. I mean, people tend to associate nuclear energy with either apocalyptic weapons or, sterile civilian power grids.
Right, there's no middle ground in the public imagination.
Exactly. But the reality detailed in these sources involves floating military cities, high-stakes geopolitical chess matches playing out in developing nations, and this is the crazy part, an unexpected, incredibly desperate battle against the weather itself.
Let's actually start with the scale of this first point because it completely reframes who the dominant players even are. Like, if you want to understand who controls nuclear power, you have to look out at the ocean.
You really do.
Because the United States doesn't just operate land plants. It operates a literal floating nuclear empire. I mean, the sources show that as of right now, the U.S. naval fleet has between 79 and 81 active nuclear-powered vessels.
Yeah, and to break that down, we are looking at 11 aircraft carriers, mostly the Nimitz class and the new Gerald R. Ford class, along with roughly 68 to 70 submarines.
Which is just a massive number of subs.
It is. And that includes your fast attack subs, your ballistic missile subs, and the cruise missile subs, too.
And the math on this gets wild when you look at the actual propulsion systems.
Yeah.
Because those aircraft carriers, they run on dual reactors.
That's right, 2 per ship.
So when you add it all up, the U.S. military is essentially running 90 to over 100 small nuclear reactors constantly moving across the world oceans. It is an entire global deterrent system that never, ever needs to pull over for gas.
And the strategic advantage of that it cannot be overstated. A nuclear submarine can operate underwater for decades without ever needing to refuel. Decades.
Which is mind-blowing.
It is. The only thing limiting its deployment is the amount of food you can carry for the crew. But to understand how a vessel can safely carry a nuclear reactor inside a sealed metal tube deep underwater, we kind of need to look at the fundamental physics of how these reactors actually operate.
Yeah, both the civilian and the military ones, right? Let's break down the mechanics of that. The sources outline 3 core components you absolutely have to master to make this work. The fuel, the brakes, and the coolant.
Right, let's start with the fuel. So you are using uranium. But natural uranium straight out of the ground is mostly the isotope U-238, which, well, it isn't great for fission.
It doesn't split easily.
Exactly. You need the isotope U-235, which easily splits and releases energy. So for a commercial or a standard reactor, that natural uranium is enriched to increase the U-235 concentration to just about 3 to 5%.
Just 3 to 5%.
Yeah, relatively low. And this enriched material is shaped into these tiny ceramic pellets and stacked inside long tubes made of zirconium alloy.
Okay, so that gives you the heat source.
Right.
The chain reaction. But obviously, you do not want a chain reaction running away from you.
No, definitely not.
Especially inside a submarine or, near a major city. So you need a highly responsive braking system.
Right, and those are your control rods. They're manufactured from very specialized materials like boron, cadmium, or hafnium.
What makes those materials special?
Well, these elements possess a unique atomic structure that acts essentially as a neutron vacuum. When you lower these rods into the reactor core, they physically block and absorb the bouncing neutrons that cause the uranium to split in the first place.
Oh, so they just soak them up.
Exactly. If you push them all the way in, the chain reaction halts entirely.
So you have the fuel and you have the brakes. Then there's the third component, which honestly seems to dictate almost everything about where and how we build these facilities, the coolant.
Yeah, because generating all that heat is useless if you can't move it. You need massive amounts of coolant to transfer the thermal energy away from the reactor core.
To spin the turbines, right?
Exactly, to spin the turbines and actually generate electricity.
Hmm.
So most commercial reactors use ordinary water, what the industry calls light water.
Okay.
But other designs, like Canada's CanDU reactors, use heavy water, and that incorporates a heavier isotope of hydrogen called deuterium.
Right, I saw that in the sources. Why use heavy water?
The heavy water is actually so efficient at moderating the neutrons that you can skip the enrichment process entirely and just use natural, unenriched uranium.
That's fascinating. And then for some of the really advanced fast reactors mentioned in the research, they aren't using water at all, are they?
No, they're not. They're pumping liquid metal, like liquid sodium or lead.
Liquid metal, that sounds insane.
It does, but those materials can transfer heat at incredibly high temperatures without boiling off, which makes them very efficient.
But regardless of whether you use light water, heavy water, or liquid metal inside the primary loop, the sources stress that almost every nuclear plant on Earth requires an external source of secondary cooling water.
Right, you need an ocean, a massive lake, or a rushing river. You have to pull in cold water, condense the steam back into a liquid after it spins the turbine, and keep the entire system from overheating.
So that secondary cooling loop is basically this invisible tether keeping these plants permanently tied to major waterways.
Exactly. They cannot exist without it.
Okay, I really want to hold on to that thought about the external cooling water, because the sources point to a massive crisis brewing right there. But first, let's look closer at the fuel enrichment you mentioned earlier. You said standard commercial reactors only need uranium enriched to about 3 to 5%.
Yeah, that is the standard threshold for civilian power.
I'm just trying to wrap my head around the international panic we constantly see in the news then. Like, if a power plant only requires a 5% enrichment level, why does the global community treat any new civilian nuclear program as a potential weapons crisis?
That's the big question. And the anxiety comes entirely from the physics of the centrifuge itself. The machinery used to enrich uranium to a safe 5% level is the exact same machinery used to enrich it to the 90% level required for a nuclear warhead.
Wait, the exact same machine?
Identical. It relies on the tiny fractional weight difference between the isotopes. U-238 is slightly heavier than U-235.
Okay.
So when you turn the uranium into a gas and spin it in a centrifuge at supersonic speeds, the heavier U-238 is forced to the outer wall. Meanwhile, the lighter explosive U-235 gathers right in the center where it can be siphoned off.
So there's basically no structural difference between a civilian enrichment facility and a military one.
None at all. The only variable is how many centrifuges you string together into a cascade and how long you let them spin.
That is terrifying.
It is. Once you feed that gas into the cascade, the line between powering a hospital and destroying a city is just a matter of time and intent.
Which is impossible to measure physically.
Right. Because the technological barrier is identical, the international community has to rely on this incredibly dense, intrusive web of legal oversight just to monitor that time and intent. And this framework is anchored by the 1968 Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is enforced by the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA.
Yet, reading through the IAEA's comprehensive safeguards in these sources, the level of surveillance they demand is just intense. It is a literal gram-by-gram accounting system.
It really is. A nation has to document every single ounce of uranium from the moment it leaves the mine, through the milling process, into the centrifuges, and out as a finished pellet.
And if there is a fractional discrepancy in the math,
It triggers an international diplomatic crisis immediately.
and the physical surveillance, the IAEA installs automated, tamper-proof cameras that run 24/7 inside these facilities.
Yeah, streaming live encrypted data straight to their headquarters in Vienna. They also apply these fiber optic seals to the nuclear material containers that instantly report if they've been cut or altered in any way.
Right. And under what they call the additional protocol, they wield this tool called complementary access, which sounds polite, but it's really not.
Not at all.
IAEA inspectors can literally show up at a sovereign nation's facility completely unannounced, with as little as 2 hours' notice. They demand entry, walk into the plant, and start swabbing the walls, the centrifuge casings, the surrounding soil.
Yeah, they're wiping for trace radioactive isotopes to prove whether the facility has secretly pushed the enrichment past that 5% mark.
Which brings up perhaps the most frustrating diplomatic hurdle mentioned in the sources: the dual-use dilemma. Because the IAEA can monitor the uranium, sure, but modern nuclear programs require incredibly specialized components.
Very specialized.
I was thinking about this dilemma, and it feels like trying to stop someone from building a weapon by regulating a local hardware store.
That's a great analogy.
Right. Like if a country starts importing massive amounts of high-strength carbon fiber, or maraging steel, or high-speed magnetic bearings, all of which are critical for building these centrifuges, how do you actually stop them?
You really can't. They simply argue that the carbon fiber is for their new aerospace division, or the magnetic bearings are for civilian medical equipment, like MRI machines.
And who's to say they aren't? The dual-use loophole completely paralyzes enforcement. You cannot legally ban a sovereign nation from purchasing industrial materials.
Exactly. It forces the IAEA and the international community into a position where they have to police a nation's internal intent, which in international law is a nearly impossible standard to meet.
And that paralysis leads to a really fascinating revelation about the United States and the sources.
Yeah.
Because we just established that the U.S. operates this dominant 80-ship floating nuclear navy.
Right. Unmatched military power.
Yet despite holding that immense military and technological superiority, the sources describe the U.S. as suffering from, quote, structural impotence, unquote, when it comes to acting as the global nuclear police.
Because military might is irrelevant in the face of international sovereignty law. The U.S. has no legal mechanism to unilaterally shut down a foreign nuclear program. If a nation hasn't signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty, or if they insist they are only pursuing peaceful civilian energy, American forces cannot just intervene.
And even if the U.S. intelligence community does catch someone clearly violating the rules and building a weapons program, they still have to navigate the United Nations.
That's the real bottleneck. To mandate legally binding international consequences, the U.S. must pass a resolution through the UN Security Council.
And what's the structural flaw there?
China and Russia both hold absolute veto power.
Right.
Any attempt by Washington to sanction a nuclear program that happens to be allied with Beijing or Moscow is instantly vetoed on the floor.
Right.
So the U.S. is left trying to patch together these fragile unilateral economic sanctions that rogue nations pretty easily bypass through black markets anyway.
And this creates a massive opening. While the West is bogged down in heavy regulations, agonizing UN vetoes, and spending literally decades trying to build massive $10 billion traditional reactors, China is bypassing that entire system.
Totally bypassing it.
They're deploying small modular reactors, or SMRs.
Yes, the Chinese Linglong one is a prime example of this pivot. SMRs are smaller, they're manufactured in factories rather than built from scratch on site, and they are much, much cheaper upfront.
So China is aggressively pushing these reactors across the developing world as part of their Belt and Road Initiative.
They are, but it's not just a standard export.
Right, because I was looking at the economics of this Belt and Road strategy, and I don't fully understand the business model. The sources suggest China is heavily subsidizing these SMRs, offering them to nations in Africa or Central Asia at incredibly steep discounts.
Massive discounts, yes.
But if these reactors cost billions in R&D to develop, why would Beijing sell them at a loss? It seems like a massive financial drain.
Well, it is a financial loss on the initial hardware, but you have to look at the timeline. By subsidizing the reactor, China is essentially buying sovereign influence.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, when a developing nation purchases a Chinese SMR to power its electrical grid, they are not just buying a piece of machinery, they are signing a contract that locks them into a 60 to 80-year structural dependency.
Meaning, they rely on China for everything that keeps the machine running.
Everything. For almost a century, that nation will rely exclusively on Beijing to supply the enriched uranium fuel, to perform the highly specialized technical maintenance, to provide software upgrades, and this is crucial to handle the extraction and disposal of the radioactive waste.
Okay, so it's the classic printer ink model,
Oh, absolutely.
but applied to geopolitics. You buy the printer at a huge discount, but you are legally bound to buy their specific brand of ink for the next 80 years. Except in this scenario, the ink is running an entire country's economy.
Exactly. If you upset Beijing, they just stop shipping the fuel, and your nation's lights literally go out.
The leverage there is absolute. It ties the developing nation's energy security directly to Chinese foreign policy for generations without firing a single shot.
It really is a brilliant, albeit concerning strategy.
Which makes you wonder if this is just checkmate for the West. I mean, the U.S. can't build giant reactors fast enough, and China is out here handing out these 80-year geopolitical traps.
It definitely looks like a monopoly forming, but the sources actually show a significant counter movement happening. The nations making up the global majority are increasingly aware of the strings attached to these deals.
They see the trap.
Yeah, they have watched debt trap diplomacy play out with ports, highways, and rail lines, and they are actively resisting handing over their baseline energy grids completely to one foreign power.
That makes sense.
Right.
We are seeing countries like Kazakhstan and Pakistan actively diversifying their portfolios, right?
Right. Even while they participate in the Belt and Road Initiative, they are deliberately inviting competing bids from France, South Korea, and Russia for their new nuclear projects.
So they are forcing China into a competitive market. They're demanding lower long-term prices and insisting on actual technology transfers rather than just accepting a closed-loop monopoly.
Exactly. It's a very smart play to maintain their sovereignty.
It really is.
Yeah.
But, as we sit here dissecting naval submarines, the physics of centrifuges, and these 80-year geopolitical traps, we are overlooking the most severe, immediate threat to this entire global industry.
We are.
And this completely caught me off guard in the research. The true Achilles heel of global nuclear power isn't a rogue state building a weapon. It isn't even China. It is the weather.
This is the central climate paradox of nuclear energy. We constantly discuss nuclear power as our ultimate zero-carbon lifeboat to survive climate change.
Right, the clean energy savior.
But extreme heat waves and climate-induced water shortages are exposing a massive thermodynamic vulnerability across the current infrastructure.
Going back to that external secondary cooling water we discussed at the very start,
Yeah.
you need cold river or ocean water to condense the steam back into a liquid after it spins the turbine.
Yes, and that condensation process isn't just about preventing the reactor from overheating, it is physically necessary to generate the electricity.
Wait, how does the cold water generate power?
So nuclear plants operate on thermodynamics, specifically the difference in temperature between the superheated steam and the cold external water. When the cold water condenses the steam, it creates a massive pressure drop. It essentially forms a vacuum that pulls more steam through the turbine blades.
Oh, I get it. So the pull of the vacuum is what spins the blades faster.
Exactly. So if the river water is too warm, that temperature difference shrinks. The vacuum weakens, the steam isn't pulled as forcefully, and the plant literally loses its physical ability to generate maximum power.
So a heat wave physically saps the strength of the plant,
Exactly.
and the data from just the last couple of years is incredibly alarming. Look at the summer of 2025 in France. The heat waves were so severe that the French energy grid had to cut a staggering 7 gigawatts of nuclear capacity simply because there wasn't enough cool water to maintain that thermodynamic pull.
And losing 7 gigawatts of baseline power during a severe heat wave, which is exactly when millions of people are turning on their air conditioning to survive, it pushes the entire grid to the brink of collapse.
Yeah, if you were paying an electric bill in Europe that summer, this thermal efficiency issue is exactly why your rate spiked.
It gets even more acute than just efficiency drops, though. In June 2026, at the Gulfec nuclear plant in southwestern France, the ambient air temperature hit 44 degrees Celsius. That's about 111 Fahrenheit.
Which is brutal.
Right. And the nearby Garonne River, which the plant relies on for that cooling vacuum, heated up to 28 degrees Celsius or over 82 Fahrenheit.
That's bathwater.
Exactly. And because of that, the plant was forced to execute a complete shutdown.
Just totally power off.
Yep. Environmental regulations dictate that you cannot discharge the reactor's heated secondary water back into a river that is already at 28 degrees. Doing so would essentially boil the local ecosystem.
Oh, wow.
You'd destroy the aquatic life and ruin the surrounding agriculture that relies on that river.
So they had to turn off a massive power plant just to save the river from boiling.
Yes.
But beyond the heat, there is this bizarre biological side effect to these warming waters that is wreaking havoc on the hardware.
Oh, the marine life issues.
Yeah. The warming oceans are triggering these unprecedented massive blooms of algae and jellyfish.
It sounds like science fiction, but it's a huge problem.
These massive swarms of jellyfish are literally clogging the machinery. In places like South Korea and Scotland, these blooms are getting sucked directly into the giant secondary cooling intake pipes of the nuclear plants.
Right, because they are pulling in so much water so fast.
Exactly. And they completely block the water flow, choking the plant and forcing operators to initiate emergency shutdowns to prevent a meltdown. Jellyfish are taking billion-dollar nuclear grids offline.
It's wild.
Yeah.
But when you connect this climate vulnerability back to China's strategy with the SMRs, the geopolitical implications are incredibly severe.
How so?
Well, China is aggressively placing these small reactors in developing countries along the Belt and Road. Many of these nations are located in incredibly hot equatorial climates. They possess fragile water infrastructure to begin with, and they are disproportionately vulnerable to the exact extreme weather events we just described.
Oh man, so they're dropping these 80-year reactors into the exact environments most likely to suffer from climate-induced cooling failures.
Precisely. It transforms a soft power asset into a massive geopolitical liability. I mean, if a Chinese-built SMR in a developing nation experiences a heat-induced failure, or if a local river dries up and forces a shutdown during a deadly heat wave, the fallout would be catastrophic.
Right, a high-profile, climate-driven failure wouldn't just impact the local population. It could shatter confidence in China's entire energy export empire overnight.
It's a huge risk they're taking.
So, to bring all of this together, we started by realizing that nuclear power is not just a static concrete building. It's a highly dynamic, moving system.
Right.
It's the U.S. Navy silently sailing 90-plus reactors around the globe. It is the IAEA sweating over the atomic weight of a gram of uranium and swabbing facility walls for isotopes.
And it's China utilizing subsidized small modular reactors to lock developing nations into 80-year geopolitical contracts.
Exactly. And, perhaps most surprisingly, it is something as simple as a warm river or a swarm of jellyfish physically shutting down the most advanced thermodynamic machines ever built by humans.
We are looking at a global landscape defined by incredible human engineering, intense legal and geopolitical friction, and a profound, inescapable vulnerability to the natural world.
Which brings up a really fascinating thought for you to ponder long after we wrap up here today.
Oh, the corporate angle.
Yes, because we have spent this entire deep dive talking about sovereign nations, the U.S., China, Russia controlling these nuclear assets. But as these small modular reactors become cheaper, smaller, and highly commercialized, a new player is entering the board entirely.
And it's not a country.
No, it's not. The next major geopolitical crisis might not be between nations at all. It will be what happens when massive tech corporations decide to buy their own private nuclear fleet.
Which is already starting to be discussed.
Right. When companies like Amazon, Google, or Microsoft decide they need dedicated off-grid SMRs just to power their massive AI data centers.
Most powerful algorithms are powered by private uranium. The entire regulatory playbook we just discussed, the UN vetoes, the IAEA state inspections, all of that basically goes out the window.
It is a totally different kind of arms race, and one we will definitely be keeping an eye on. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the forces that power our world, and remember to look past the concrete domes. We'll catch you next time.